Hello, welcome to A Little Too Quiet, the Ferndale Library podcast. It's brought to you by the Friends of the Ferndale Library, and my name is Jeff Milo. It's the end of the year, and we thought we would look back on some of the interviews that we conducted with some best-selling authors. Included in today's episode, we'll be looking back at conversations that we had with C.J. Box, Lucy Clarke, J. Ryan Stradal, Grady Hendrix, Stephen Rowley, and Riley Sager. We'll start off with C.J. Box, New York Times bestselling author of 30 novels, including, perhaps best known for, the Joe Pickett series, which are thrillers set in Wyoming featuring a dogged, sometimes literally dogged, game warden. C.J. Box is a Wyoming native himself. He's won several awards for his captivating fiction, and he, before becoming a best-selling author, worked as a ranch hand, surveyor, fishing guide, and worked at a small-town newspaper as a reporter and editor. The Joe Pickett series is, of course, very popular. It's now been adapted into a television series, and the very latest book was called Stormwatch, in which C.J. Box's protagonist, Wyoming game warden Joe Pickett, investigates a mysterious death at a secret, remote, high-tech facility. Here's a bit of our chat with C.J. Box.
A little bit, yeah. Since the very beginning, I was never planning a series. I never sat down and thought, the world's waiting for a Wyoming game warden series out there. It just happened. The publisher wanted more books based on the first one, Open Season, and it's developed that way. But since the very first one, I did want a protagonist who was almost anti crime novel protagonist, in that he's a state employee, devoted to his family, devoted to his job, loves being outside, feels guilty that he can't make enough money to really take care of his family the way he should, and has everyday problems, money problems. He makes mistakes. I think that he's understandable for a lot of readers, but the dirty little secret is, I think it increases the tension when you know that Joe is not just going to beat everybody up or outshoot anybody. His main attribute is basically his doggedness, not his brilliance or his violence.
Right. Something about Joe, again, though, is that he, we're talking about how he's kind of humble, but he's also not a pushover. And there are more than a few characters in here who are really pushing against him and block him out, and possibly they really don't like him at all. And yes. But one of my favorite things about reading these books, and I'm really curious to hear what your favorite thing is the team that Joe kind of has. He has his family, he has his friends, he has people he can really confide in, people who can maybe advise him on things before he makes any brash decisions. Those are some of my favorite parts of the books because there's a lot of tension. Joe gets into all these confrontations, but he has that team and his family and his friends to kind of bounce ideas off of. So that's been my favorite thing. As you've written Joe, has that been one of your favorite things, or is it something else entirely?
No, this book is a little different. Yeah. From previous ones. All those characters are always there. The family, right. Nate Romanowski, all those. This is the first time they've all come together as a team. And that's because of the circumstances that are going on in the book. And that's something I'm particularly proud of with this one and happy with, that was very hard to do, was to basically build this team and then have an ending that I thought of as kind of like a Godfather ending, where everybody's involved, every thread gets resolved, every problem gets solved all at once.
Right.
And it was fun to write and kind of exhilarating, because I've always wanted to try to do that.
I know, but how rewarding though. You've been able to build these characters. It's one thing to say that I wasn't sure it was going to be a series, or I didn't intend to be a series, but isn't that kind of, I think the word you used was exhilarating, to have us set up these characters so that now you can do these kinds of things. It felt like the ending of a suspenseful action movie, as any of your novels should.
Well, thank you. The more characters, the harder in some ways, because there's just so many balls in the air.
Right.
But at the same time, if I think I've gotten to know the characters. I know their characteristics. Readers certainly do. They know kind of what to expect or what could happen based on like Nate Romanowski's propensity for violence, and put that all into a mix. And I think it's a lot of fun.
And that was our chat with CJ Box. We'll move on to another conversation that we had, this time with author Lucy Clarke, who specializes in what's known as destination thrillers. Those titles include The Castaways, One of the Girls, and most recently, The Hike. Some of her works, including the title known as The Blue, has been released as a major international show for Paramount+. The Castaways is currently being filmed on location, due to be adapted as a series, again for Paramount+. One of the Girls, meanwhile, was a book that we here at the Ferndale Library featured in one of our book clubs and spurred a pretty rousing conversation amongst our patrons. Clarke's latest was The Hike, and in that story, 4 friends are leaving behind their everyday lives and heading out into the beautiful Norwegian wild, where there's nothing between them and the mountain peak but forest, sea, and sharp blue sky, but there's a darker side to the wilderness, as the cast of characters discover. So we spoke with Clarke about her specialty, again, which is destination thrillers.
Yeah, of course. So The Hike is set on a trail in Norway, and I always start my novels with place. So that's kind of the thing that comes first rather than a plot hook. It's place. It's what world do I want to inhabit and where am I sort of passionate about? So I knew I wanted to do a book about hiking, or have that as a mechanic that sort of leads the structure through the story. And I really wanted to travel to Norway because it's just such true remote wilderness, and it has some of the best hiking trails in the world. So I decided to set it there, and then went off on a research trip with my backpack and my hiking boots and tent and stove and things, and was joined by my husband. And we went hiking for, we did a sort of 5-day night trail, just a made up one, the two of us. And we didn't see another hiker for the entire time. It was absolutely crazy. It really felt so remote, and it very much brought the landscape to life, those kind of emotions to life that you might have when you are out in the wilderness. And so it really helped me then kind of inform my characters and just kind of what I wanted to then make the novel about, really.
Sure. Maybe the word eerie is appropriate too when it is that remote, right? Is that there's just kind of something a little scary is not the right word, but we're so used to the hustle and the bustle and the noise and the city and what have you, and cars and people everywhere. It's kind of weird on our modern minds to get out there, or at least speaking from my personal experience. But you capture that.
I completely agree. It definitely felt eerie to see the mobile phone coverage just kind of disappearing bar by bar as we walked. And, you go through all those things of like, well, what if something happens? What would I do? Yeah, it was eerie. That's exactly the right word.
Right. And I have to presume, as a writer, your brain is constantly doing that, like, what? But what if? And did you have those thoughts obviously occur while you were out there on the trail?
Absolutely. I did, all the time, about very small things. In Norway, they have these DNT cabins, they're called, that are very small, sort of beautiful wooden buildings in the middle of nowhere, very remote places. Mm-hmm. And they are, it's a government-run operation, and they're left unlocked for hikers, or in snowy season for kind of snowshoers or whoever to come by and have a place of refuge. And we planned to kind of hike to some of these DNT cabins that we'd seen on a map, like a kind of a hiking map. And we just felt like, you're walking in the middle of nowhere in a mountain plateau thinking, is there really going to be a cabin out here? Is this true? So we bought our own tent just in case we got kind of caught out. Mm-hmm. Then when you get, we found our first cabin one evening just as the light was starting to fade, and you're kind of on the threshold thinking, but what if it's locked? Mm-hmm. And then you kind of push the door and think, okay, amazing, it's open. And then the next thought is like, who's going to be inside? We're in the middle of nowhere. And once you get in, we found the cabins empty, but in, I think, height of summer, you might find them with other people in.
Sure.
But then, once night falls and you've lit the fire and you're kind of getting in your sleeping bag, you then start thinking, who's going to turn up? So there was a lot of what if moments and questions. And I think all of that was really fun for exploring in the novel.
And that was our chat with Lucy Clarke. We're going to switch genres slightly. We're going to stay in the thriller realm, but we're going to get a bit more into horror with our next author, Rowley Sager, New York Times bestselling author of Survive the Night, Final Girls, The House Across the Lake, and his most recent, The Only One Left. This is a bit of a throwback to Gothic horror novels. It's about Lenora Hope, who supposedly hung her sister. The Hope family murders have shocked the Maine coast one bloody night way back in 1929. While most people assume that the then 17-year-old Lenora was responsible, the police were never able to prove it. Other than her denial after the killings, she has never spoken publicly about that night, nor has she set foot outside of Hope's End, the cliffside mansion where the massacre occurred. But the book flashes forward to 1983, and home health aide Kit arrives at the decaying Hope's End to care for Lenora after her previous nurse fled in the middle of the night. In her 70s and confined to a wheelchair, Lenora was rendered mute by a series of strokes and can only communicate with Kit by tapping out sentences on an old typewriter, and one night, Lenora uses it to make a tantalizing offer to Kit to tell her everything about what happened in 1929. Here's our chat with Rowley Sager about The Only One Left.
Yeah, Kit has, like most of my protagonists, Kit has gone through some things.
Sure.
And I always find that fascinating because I love damaged characters, because in some way we're all damaged. Like, the pandemic messed us up so much in ways that we still are discovering. Like, it threw everyone for a loop. And so I wanted to put her in this situation that is so foreign to her, but also she can relate to, because first and foremost, she is a caregiver. Like, she stresses this, I care. And she does have to do everything for this woman who might be a murderess. And so she has to feed her, she has to bathe her, she has to do everything. And there's this great scene where Kit is, holding Lenora's hand just to sort of like checking the reflexes, and realizes, oh, she might have killed her family with this hand. And then she just drops it instinctively. And then she feels guilty about dropping it. And it's this whole mess of emotions that she's feeling, where she needs to she needs to keep this woman alive. Yet she's also a bit frightened of her. Yet she also kind of likes her. And she sees herself in Lenora in many, many ways. And some might be a little bit spoilerish, but like, sure, she looks at Lenora and she kind of sees a reflection of herself. And that to me was very fascinating, to have this caregiver going through this gamut of emotions while at the same time navigating a mansion that is literally tilted and falling, leaning toward the sea, and that she's literally unbalanced, like both literally and figuratively. And I thought that the house was a great way to show her mental state.
100%. And I don't know how many interviewers you're going to come across who's going to say this, but over the last 3 years, I've become a caregiver. And so I can say, you got it. Like, this whole vibe of kind of just an indiscriminate care. This whole you are being called upon kind of thing, or the empathy that comes into it. Whether you have, maybe it's your parents or not, whether you have baggage with the person or not, it's literally just like holding a frail human body in your hands because you want to help them stay alive. And you caught that in Kit perfectly.
Oh, thank you so much.
100%. So there's that. But I'm not taking care of a potential murderer, though. That I know of.
Are, I think. Yeah, that's true.
But yeah. So talk about just developing the mystery and Because I almost wonder, like, do you as an author, do you get kind of a corkboard out? Do you have to keep these wires from getting crossed in your own head as you're developing it?
Sometimes I do have to resort to, and I'm in my office where I write right now, and if you could see like the floor over there, you would see several dozen index cards.
I knew it.
Arranged on the floor where I'm trying to figure out the plot of my next book. And so like with the only one left, I did have to do a similar thing where there were so many threads to keep track of that I eventually needed to just be, okay, I'm doing the index card on the floor thing and just rearranging and trying to figure it out. Because it is a very tricky balance. There's a lot going on in this book. And a lot of it is beneath the surface. Like Lenora is this very silent and still being. And you know what they say about still waters? They run deep. And there's a lot going on in Lenora's head.
Right.
And just there's a lot going on in the house in general. Like everyone there has some kind of secret. Everyone there has some kind of ulterior motive. And Kit has to kind of sift through it all and talk to them all. And I don't know if I trust him. I don't know if I believe him. I trust him now. And then later she doesn't, and that kind of thing. And it was very difficult as a writer to just keep it all on track and keep it moving and keep it in a way that the reader won't get utterly lost.
Sure. That was Riley Sager, author of The Only One Left. Now we're going to listen back to a bit of our chat with Stephen Rowley, New York Times bestselling author of Lily and the Octopus, as well as The Guncle and the editor. The Guncle was a favorite here amongst our staff. We also featured it on one of our book club discussions. That book, The Guncle, also went on to win the Thurber Prize for American Humor. And Stephen Rowley specializes in books that can make you cry as much as they make you chuckle. The latest, The Celebrants, is been heralded as a big chill for our times. It's about 5 college friends who haven't seen each other in 5 years, but have kind of an interesting ceremony whenever they reunite. They have been getting together every so often to perform mock eulogies for one another. They'll all get into a room, they'll act and imagine as though one of them have just died, and they will deliver eulogies for each other, for that one person whose turn it is, really, to have a quote-unquote funeral. But what happens when one of these 5 friends, as they enter into their 50s, is actually now terminally ill? This reunion is going to be different. The Celebrants is a deeply honest tribute to the growing pains of selfhood and the people who keep us going, coupled with Rowley's signature humor and heart. It's a moving tale about the false invincibility of youth and the beautiful ways in which friendship helps us celebrate our lives, even amid the deepest challenges of living.
That's right. And I think that's something you can do with longstanding friends, right? You don't always have to be on your best behavior. You don't always have to be the best version of yourself. You can let them see you be weak. You can let them see you be messy, and they still have to love you afterwards. And there is something about these lifelong friendships that I think are so essential. You know, people who knew you before, you know, when you had youthful dreams and the different elements of your life were not locked into place, and know you now, you know, once, you know, it's sort of more settled what your career is, what your life is, who you ended up with, you know, in your personal life. Sure. And they love both versions of you. And it's sometimes these long-standing friends that can help bridge the difference between those two versions of yourself if they're not exactly aligned. And so I just think these, you know, and it doesn't have to be college friends. For some people, it may be siblings, it may be cousins, it may be, you know, grade school friends, or who knows. But, you know, having people in your life for long stretches of time, I just think is so, you know, it's so interesting and something that was a lot of fun to write about.
And I say death, but that's only because the crux of this book is about how these friends have a pact in which they get together and they're going to enact their own eulogies in a way. And I think we all think about that. What will people say about me when I'm gone? But more importantly, what this book does is, what am I going to say about my best friend when they're gone? and epiphanies arise. Again, the dialogue allows for the comedy, but I think epiphanies arise, and I think there's something extremely heartfelt, I think, in your afterword, where you're like, maybe don't wait to say these things to your friends. That's what the book really became about for me.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of conversation among artists and writers, particularly about how to address the past few years that we've been through.
Yeah.
Some people have tackled it head on. One of my favorite writers is Elizabeth Strout. She wrote a book, Lucy by the Sea, last year that is almost a kind of a TikTok, a minute by minute retelling of 2020, which to me was like a horror story. Like I'm not ready to revisit that quite yet. But this is, I think, very much a reaction to what we've been through, because, so many of us are grieving something. We may not have lost a person, although many, many people have been lost, but we certainly have lost time, and we've lost togetherness. And so the idea of crafting a story around telling the people in your lives what they mean to you now, while they're still here, to hear that and hopefully receive those words with an open heart, I think is very much a reaction to the past few years and what we've been through.
Yeah, I think that's really relatable, and I think this goes into story. And a word I felt compelled to bring up is this. Help me with this, Stephen. It's not. We have things to deal with. I didn't want to use the word baggage, but we have emotional baggage.
Yeah.
I think this book is, I use the word cathartic, but there's something really healthy going on here about working through these things, which I think was pulled off again in the Guncle too, but also here as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of writing comedies about grief. I don't know why I chose to do this.
But it hurts so good.
I'm sensing a theme. Yeah.
Can you just talk about again, if you were having a chance to do an afterword here before I let you go, like what do you hope people take away from this book in an ideal scenario?
Absolutely. I was struck earlier this year. I was incredibly fortunate, and I won the Thurber Prize for American Humor for the Guncle, and I wanted to get on stage and be like, haha, surprise, it's actually a book about grief,
right?
And you're giving me this humor award, but I do think laughing is the way through, and as I say, not holding off, not I guess if I've changed in the past few years, I've become a little bit of a mush. So people, I will tell people, and my friends are like, I'll approach them. I'm like, I love you. And they're like, we know, back off. But I would love that for everyone, the ability to both have people in their lives that are important to them, and to be able to say, I will say, as an openly gay writer too, the idea of found family is so important in queer literature, and definitely a recurring theme. And I look, when I came out 30 years ago, the literature that was available to me, which reflected the time, right? It was very honest about the time, but was about sort of lives lived in the shadows of lonely existences, and often lives cut short. And the opposite has been true. I've been fortunate to be alive in a moment where my life has been filled with community and joy and celebration. And so I want people to embrace that they're and we're in a precarious moment of backslide in a lot of things, but there's still much to celebrate in that.
That was Stephen Rowley talking about The Celebrants. Up next, we have J. Ryan Stradal, who again is another staff favorite, author of Kitchens of the Great Midwest and The Lager Queen of Minnesota. We talked to Stradal about his latest, Saturday Night at the Lakeside Supper Club. The protagonist in this novel, Mariel Prager, needs a break. Her husband Ned is having an identity crisis. Her spunky beloved restaurant, the Lakeside Supper Club, is bleeding money by the day, and her mother Florence is now stubbornly refusing to leave the church where she's been holed up for more than a week. Ned, her husband, meanwhile, is actually the heir to a chain of home-style diners, and while he doesn't have a head for business, he knows his family's chain could provide a better future than his wife's fading restaurant. But then they suffer a devastating tragedy, and they almost lose everything. And with their dreams dashed, can one fractured family find a way to rebuild despite their losses, and will the Lakeside Supper Club be their salvation? This is a book where we are once again getting J. Ryan Stradal's signature, honest, lovable, yet fallible Midwestern characters as they grapple with love, loss, and marriage, what we hold on to and what we leave behind, and what our legacy will be when we are gone.
I love the fallibility and reliability issues that come with the character speaking from their own point of view. And close third. I mean, early on, I had a writing instructor tell me that, oh, you'll believe what another character says about a character, but never what the character says about themselves. So I really enjoy exploring that subjectivity and letting the reader come to his or her own conclusions about what is real and what is exaggerated or false in a character's recollection or actions. And I try to put things in present time as much as possible, so things aren't merely recollections, because then you're also dealing with the weight of the wisdom. Like, why am I telling it from this point? Is the received wisdom from the intervening time going to be a factor in this recollection? No, quite often I'd rather have characters experience things in real time where they may not be equipped with such wisdom, where you understand how they become the person they are through how they dealt with a crisis in their childhood or teenage years. And I thought that would be important with Florence, because I'd written all of Mariel's chapters first. And had that been all that existed of Florence, Florence might come across at worst as sort of a stock comic, Midwestern lady of a certain age. And we have more than enough of that.
Right.
I grew up with these women. I don't want to reduce them to a stereotype or a caricature. I wanted Florence the opportunity to tell her own story. Go back, and I want the reader to experience that story along with her and understand her better. They still may not agree with her. I've had readers already tell, the book's not even out yet, and I've gotten emails from people like, I hated Florence. Like, I would have given this book like 5 stars if it weren't for Florence. Florence reminded me of my mom, it brought her too many bad memories, Man. I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, Florence is based on, people I've known.
Right.
But also people that I love.
Right.
And I want to give them a fair shake. It's like, yeah, sure, there's people out there that suffered trauma that never worked on it, never will work on it. And won't communicate enough about that trauma to generate empathy in their children. Like even their own children don't know the extent of what they experienced and might appreciate it if they did. Like, for example, like when what little Mariel knows about her mom's childhood comes through, and like, well, in my day, like, we didn't have warm breakfasts every morning.
Right.
Like at one point, Mariel says something like, the only thing I knew about my mom was its many, like the lessons from her many privations. Yeah. And so, yeah, exactly. When something becomes didactic or dogmatic, yeah, you're not going to have empathy with that.
Right.
When someone like clearly is vulnerable and shares their suffering with you, you can. And I wanted to give the reader that shake with Florence. Like, I don't think Florence would ever be vulnerable with Mariel. I mean, eventually she kind of is.
Sure.
Like, but, on her own terms. But I wanted the reader, nonetheless, to have that opportunity. Yeah. So, like I said, they still may not like Florence, but at least they'll understand her.
This book is very much about motherhood, and I always thought that Lager Queen was also about motherhood, and I don't necessarily want to get into kind of a Barbara Walters moment with you, but you, and this is not me speaking, this is the Fairer Sex who work here and speaking, they say he writes women so well, and I read, of the books, I'm like, oh man, he just knows how to make a character, and by that he really knows how to craft a female character. And I have to imagine that came from, you said you grew up with these women. When you became a novelist, you could have written thrillers or action or sci-fi, but you really wanted to bring these people to the page. I think that's worth remarking upon.
Wow. Yeah, I've never heard anyone put it quite like that before. That, yeah, I really could have.
You could have done anything.
Yeah.
But you're bringing these people to life, and it does feel like it is an homage to the people who are probably big influences on your life. I know that's a yes or no question.
Absolutely. Absolutely it is. And I write to keep my mom alive. I write to communicate with her, and she's in these characters.
Yeah.
I have to, I want to honor and continue her legacy. And, to the extent I can, try to be the writer that she couldn't be. So, yeah, also not seeing women like the women I grew up with represented in fiction often enough. That alone was a motivation, but writing to communicate with my mom is what I think really drives me. And early on in my writing career, I wrote mostly comedic stuff. I wrote stuff to amuse myself and my friends. And eventually I had a writing instructor named Lou Matthews at UCLA Extension when I started taking writing classes as an adult in my late 20s and early 30s, who told me, once you start writing about things you care about, your work's going to get a lot better. And I know what I care about. I know what I'm avoiding. And that's processing the grief over my mom's death. You know, she died 18 years ago. She never lived to see my first published story. And whenever some piece of publicity comes out, like I was in People magazine last week, my mom would have loved that. Yeah. My mom was totally normcore. Yeah. You know, like she loved chain Mexican restaurants and, you know, dirty martinis and, you know, and People magazine and reality television. And like that would have been just to the moon. Like that would have been better than me being in the New Yorker, right, you know, or something like that. That wouldn't have rated for her like People. Yeah. You're like, yeah. And I think, oh man, I miss her so much. And when I'm writing her, I miss her. You know, I get to be with that. I get to work on it. I get to inhabit this space where she's like, these books, like my box of books that are right behind me, arrived on the 18th anniversary of her death. And I remember thinking, and I actually posted this, like, she's dead, but in these books, she's alive. Mm-hmm. Like, here she is. Like, and that's why I do this. You know, that's why I write about these women. You know, I write to keep my mom alive, and also, you know, honor her and her friends and my other my Aunt Connie, my Grandma Doris, my Grandma Esther, my great Aunt Sissy. Like, they didn't get to write books. Mm-hmm. You know, so I do my best to honor them and write about them.
And that was J. Ryan Stradal talking about the Lakeside Supper Club, his latest. Now, for our last chat, we have Grady Hendrix, who spoke with us on our podcast about his latest, How to Sell a Haunted House. Grady Hendrix has been quite a unique horror novelist, I would say. He has always spliced in a bit of meta-commentary and humor and surrealism. His books include Horror Store, which is kind of like an IKEA set horror novel, My Best Friend's Exorcism, and the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. His latest maybe tells you exactly what it's all about with the title, How to Sell a Haunted House, but it really is a novel about families and especially about siblings. Here's our chat with Grady Hendrix.
But you think you know who they are, and they're not. You know, I have 3 older sisters, and they all grew up. I'm the youngest, and I'm a boy in a family of girls, and so they're always like, "Oh, you had it so easy. You're so spoiled." And I'm like, "No, man, I know pain too." But I wanted to do that with Mark, where the reader would feel like, "I got this guy pegged. I know who this is. This obnoxious dude," and just to have that moment that I think we all have with our siblings at some point, where we think, I don't know you. I thought I did, but this is a part of you I do not know. Mm-hmm. There's been a couple of moments in my life where a sibling or a parent or even a close friend, I've seen them in a different context, and I've been like, I didn't know that. I don't know this person the way. Maybe what I think I know about this person are my assumptions about this person. Mm-hmm. And Louise, I love those guys, those big, loud people who take up space. They're fun to write. But Louise was harder for me because she's a very locked down oldest sibling, you know, who does the right things, who leads the right life. And I didn't want her to be boring. Mm-hmm. And that was hard. Mm-hmm. It's hard to have someone who follows the rules and does the right things and is the responsible party, who doesn't seem like a stiff or like a repressed jerk. Mm-hmm. And so that was almost harder to get in a way.
Well, in a way, I'm not spoiling this because it's already appeared in recent reviews I've seen, is other people have already spoiled that, there are squirrels. There are squirrels, taxidermied squirrels that come to life. And then eventually the antagonist of this book is a creepy doll. Or a puppet. And so one thing to do is to put Louise, this put upon character, and have her basically face sanity questioning surrealism. So there is that. But before I'll let you answer.
Well, I was just going to say really quickly is yeah, exactly. Well, that was my key into Louise, to be like, well, she's locked down because she needs to be, because she's had that experience that shows what happens when you aren't.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then before I let you go, let's talk about just the crux of this. How did you land on dolls and puppets? I do think that, folk art has a kind of spookiness in general, but how did you get to the central monster, I guess, of this character?
Because I am a depraved pervert with no remorse, and I clearly grew up in a cellar eating roaches.
I knew it.
Puppets and dolls are a sad thing to inflict on a reader, but also, besides taxidermy, they are the inanimate object that can make eye contact. And there is something, they're alive, but they're not alive. And we treat them like they're alive, but sometimes we just throw them on the couch. They are complicated and they occupy a weird space in our heads. And I think we all have weird relationships with inanimate objects that we don't think about enough. Like, I'm sure you've had a laptop where you're like, oh, no. You're like begging it not to crash.
Right.
Or like go faster. Right. Or your car, you're like, oh, come on. Oh my God, you do not do this to me right now. And so we interact with all these inanimate objects as if they're alive. And I thought, not enough people were exploiting that. So I stuck my finger right in that soft spot and twisted.
I love how psychological your books can get, because when we play with these dolls, if I had it on my hand, am I not projecting a part of my psyche to give it voice?
That's not what it feels like, though.
Yeah.
What it feels like is you've got another creature right there on the end of your arm.
Wild. We'll leave it there as... Folks, you can enter this haunted house that they're trying to sell, and what happens when they encounter a creepy doll. Grady Hendrix, thanks so much for joining us on this podcast.
Dude, thank you so much for having me. And for being so aesthetically 100%.
You got it, man. Take care.
Bye.
And that'll do it for our look back on all of our conversations that we had with best-selling authors here on our podcast. This is, of course, A Little Too Quiet. It's brought to you by the Friends of the Ferndale Library. Remember to rate, review, subscribe, and tell your friends about this little podcast that we produce right here inside the Ferndale Library. Wish you a happy new year and happy reading.